Welcome to the Culture Roundtable, brought to you by Culture and Sports. At Culture and Sports, we bring discussion about the importance and impact of organizational success, team and athlete performance, and the short and long term mental, physical, and emotional health of athletes. We do this by talking about the impact and the importance of leadership and organizational culture. We accomplish this by articles, podcasts, and video shows, curriculum and courses, our Sports Leader of the Year program, annual leadership summit, and this culture roundtable that you're joining us at today. Nearly everyone that has participated in sports has experienced an old school coach. But how does an old school coach impact athletes, the team, and success? I'm Jeremy Piasecki, the Executive Director of Culture and Sports, and I'd like to introduce you to Satara Murray, Ron Wuotila, Kyle Stark, and Sydney Moore to our audience. Thank you for joining us today, Kyle. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, Kyle Stark, background in professional baseball, coached in college, and then worked in front office of Major League Baseball for over 15 years, and now work with coaches and leaders in a number of different arenas trying to drive great cultures.
Hi, Sydney. Can you please share your background with us?
Hi everyone, I'm Sydney. I'm a Division I volleyball player. I played at Cornell and now at Syracuse getting my master's. And I host a podcast called Let's Talk About It that does all the student athlete issues and do a lot of consulting projects with different athletic departments.
Good afternoon, Ron. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. Ron Wuotila, president of RW Sport Performance. Background in coaching and sport leadership. The coaching side was in the sport of basketball. The last 10 years I've spent in high performance sport, mostly in the Olympic, Paralympic space, helping coaches and leaders show up as a better version of themselves and helping organizations kind of look back and assess performance to kind of march forward in an even better way.
Good evening, Satara. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Satara Murray. I'm a current professional, football player in England for Sheffield United. I'm currently the club captain. Currently my last season, actually. And yeah, I've been a professional soccer player for the last 10 years, playing both in the NWSL, Professional Women's League in America, and then the Women's Super League and Women's Championship here in England. And I also attended the University of North Carolina, winning a national championship back in 2012.
And then you also play for a national team, correct?
Yeah, I don't really anymore. I used to play for the
Ah,
Jamaican women's national team. But yeah, so just a little bit of history with that.
got it. Got it. So, Ron, I would like to start with you. Um, when you think of old school coaching, what does that mean to you?
Well, what a great question, because that was going to be my first question for all of us, was the definition of this topic or this label. So, and this is, I just want to make sure the audience know this isn't a setup, because I mean my notes that I've made for this was basically I see it as two things. I see the bad version of old school coaching as we think about it is all about command and control, all about one way
Mhm.
direction, communication, and I think that harshness is a part of that. So if we're thinking about if somebody says, "What do you think of old school coaching?" I think a lot of people would say it's those related to those three things. Um, Great, productive, effective old school coaching is mission focused. There's an environment of accountability, and it's development centered. So when I was asked by you, Jeremy, to be on this panel, I thought, what a great opportunity. That my first thought was to talk about all the great parts of the
Mhm.
category of old school coaching, because I think mission focused, accountability and development are every athlete wants that. I mean, there's just very few that, and if they don't think they want that, I think if they really deeply reflect, that's exactly what they want. That's the environment they want to step into. So I have a whole bunch of thoughts about why is it that the second option doesn't happen more often. And I know we'll dig into that, but Jeremy, those are the thoughts I have when I going back, several months ago when you asked me to be part of this, that came to mind in terms of dividing the two categories.
So Tara, what has your experience been with old school coaches?
Yeah, you know what? Reflecting on it and really thinking about it, obviously I'm 31, so the way in which I've seen soccer progress in terms of the coaching styles has is like night and day. Um, it was I look at it and I reflect and I think it was good for me personally because I think it not only allowed me to develop as an athlete, but in terms of developing my character as a person, I think that was huge. It's kind of like what Ron was saying in terms of creating a space for development. It's not just developing just as a player, as an athlete, as also as a person. And I felt in the way in which I got coached from my youth soccer career to my collegiate career, even to the early phases of my professional career, I think it getting the coaching style that I did, old school coaching, allowed me to develop and ultimately allowed me to become the woman that I am today. But if I look back on it and think, oh, some of the styles and some of the things and some of the ways in which I was treated when I was younger, I don't think any of that could really you can really do that in today's way of athletics. In sports, I just think it's too the culture has changed and has shifted way too much. But looking back on it now, I enjoyed it. I mean, obviously at the time probably didn't really think, oh, this is, I didn't feel too good about myself. But looking back and reflecting on it now, I think it ultimately was beneficial. And it allowed me to become not just a really good athlete, but just a really good human being overall.
Sydney, how have old school coaches impacted your performance?
That's such a good question. I think again, there's two parts of it. Like the negative part of old school coaching, I would say a lot of self-doubt and questioning myself and a lot of confidence issues that I've had to, work throughout my career. And then on the positive angle, I do think the coaches that I had who focused a lot on development and kind of made me, be a good teammate and kind of learn some of that humility has also been something that's helped me, eventually now, like I'm trying to go play pro. I don't think if I had that mix of coaching, that I'd be where I am. So as much as I'm, sad about all of the, confidence and things that I had um, as a result of the negative part of old school coaching, those are also things that built resilience that help me now today. So, it's kind of a gray area.
Kyle, in your experience, how have you seen old school coaches interacting with their teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think to echo kind of the general theme that's being shared here, I think for me, it's less about old school and new school and more about good coaching. And as I've spent time with thousands of coaches over the years, and you ask them about the most impactful coach they've ever been around, most impactful leader they've ever been around, I don't think the recipe for what great coaching looks like has changed. I think the floor has been raised in terms of what we expect from our coaches and leaders. And so I think the things that have made really good coaches generations ago versus today, there's a lot of commonalities in those. I think we've done a better job of identifying the productive and less productive ways of tackling some of those things. I think what ends up happening, though, is similar to parenting. We either really liked the way we were parented and we continue those trends, or we swing the pendulum the other way, as opposed to really identifying what are those key principles we need to do. And so I think when you ask the question, how have I seen old school coaches engage their teams and their athletes, I've seen very unproductive ways of reflecting Ron's comments about command and control, or as Cindy and Satara commented, from an athlete's perspective of potentially challenging confidence or whatever else. I've also seen some of those coaches do a great job of seeing that person for who they are and getting the most out of them, aimed at something bigger than just themselves. And the last thing I'll share with this is, it's amazing as we've swung the pendulum away. It's amazing how many times you go into programs now and they are craving accountability because there's no accountability. So I think we just have to be aware of what is good coaching and see some of those trends as opposed to old school versus new school.
The whole group here, we've already started talking about how old school coaching doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. Can you please share and can we go a little more in depth about what the positives are from old school coaching?
I think, Ron, if you want to since you've identified those three things, maybe go a little bit deeper with each of those and we can build off of them.
That's kind of you. I was gonna be building off of all the stuff that you guys have been sharing. Holy mackerel, Jeremy. So I do think that at the end of the day, I mean, Kyle said something really important. I mean, like that we want to talk about what old school coaching looks like in a negative light on this forum. There's no denying that because you can tackle it when you identify it, right? Describe it. But Kyle saying, this is really about good coaching. And also the other piece that Kyle said that's incredibly important is that the floor has been raised. I mean, coaching today is just incredibly different than it was 20, 30 years ago. I do think it comes back to understanding where you're going, mission focused, creating an environment of accountability. I've in the last 10 years, I've worked at a bunch of different levels, including the youth level as a volunteer back in Calgary at a basketball club. And there was, I can't remember if it was Sydney or Satara commenting about accountability, or maybe it was Kyle. I think there's a void right now because I think we're all a little bit confused who takes the lead here, like who's in charge of accountability. Because like I know a lot of coaches who are scared of that. They're afraid to do that, but good coaching involves accountability. And then the development centered piece is both athletes spoke to that. That's why we get into sport. Satara's comments. Satara made a comment maybe 3 times about her as a person, not just as a player. So I think the first thing that we have to do is define it. And I think mission focused, environment of accountability, development centered is the starting point, because I think a lot of people don't actually, in my practice, one of the first things I do with clients is define what is coaching. Like not even just good coaching, what is coaching? And it's interesting how long people take to answer that question. There's a bit of a pause because we can't actually describe it. And in my world, coaching is in its simplest form is teaching and leading. I'd be interested to hear from Sydney and Satara around that, their coach's ability to shift back and forth from their responsibilities to teach the technical side of their sport and then move to the leadership side. So I think that's a huge part of it. And then the other thing that I'll throw out there, and I'm kind of throwing a lot of content out there to see how people want to run with it, is compared to 20 years ago, we have specialist coaches. So 20, 30 years ago, you had to figure out every single element of coaching, the psychology of it, the physical development side of it, the technical, the tactical. I was lucky in the first 7 years of my coaching career, I had to figure out everything, all of those things, plus how to use a VHS machine to edit tape to, and to how do I wrap ankles. And I think, coaches today, especially in the NCAA, they become motivators or recruitment specialists or tactical specialists. And then all of a sudden they become head coaches of programs and they are not fully armed. So, Kyle, thanks for the setup. I would say, I think I still stand by those 3 things. I think we have to slow down and actually define what coaching is. And then we need to recognize whether our coaches are actually fully armed to do the job.
I'll pick up there, Ron. I really like what you're saying about the coach's role. I had written down in my notes, like the guidance. I feel like I've noticed now, like it's so weird. I'm 23. I'm a grad student. Like I'm a baby, even when it comes to being an athlete still, right? Like, but I've noticed a big difference in like, I guess my section of the generation compared to the girls who I coach when I go back home for club at our club, or even freshmen or sophomores now on the team. And then it's been a conversation between, the grad students and the captains on our team versus kind of the younger girls or the underclassmen. And, for my podcast and everything I do, I talk so much about student athlete empowerment, being able to speak up and know what works for your body or how you work best, and understanding maybe, when coaches are taking it too far or when other teammates are taking it too far. But I feel like in that there's so many athletes now who want kind of control of the process. Things are becoming more athlete focused. Athletes want to know why. They want to have, they want to know that whatever they're doing is going to work. And there's a lot of doubt in the coach's ability to guide now, because maybe it's not as comfortable for the athletes, or they're not used to it, or they've always been allowed to kind of say what's going to happen. And I feel like that's a big, maybe a problem in college athletics that's starting to happen. This idea of trusting the process. I feel like that's one of the biggest things that I've seen as a difference between old school coaching and kind of what's happening now. Where in the past, the athlete was just trying to get picked by the coach, and you just did everything that they said and you believed, everything they said, and you were just kind of proving yourself. And now I feel like a lot of the times coaches are proving themselves to athletes in a way, and they're not able to do their full job. They're not able to have that full trust of the team. And then, of course, none of the things, none of the drills, none of their tactics are necessarily working because they're not able to get that full trust of the team. So it's an interesting model that's happening now.
I love as Cindy, as you share that idea of, back in the day, we'll use that term, the coach had the authority because they were in a position of authority, and to some extent probably we just had less access to all this information. And now that has, everybody's got so much access to so much information that we've empowered a lot of people. I think sometimes we forget that just because you have information doesn't mean it's good information or that you're even equipped to do anything with it. And so I think, just as I was listening to you share, Cindy, I think we swung the pendulum from all power authority in that coach's position to empowering the athlete and their voice. They have ownership of their career as well, but I think we have to settle on a place where it's a both and, right? We each have some responsibility. The coach has some responsibility, the player has some responsibility in that, because, and I love, Ron shared to kick this off with mission focus. I think as we've become very athlete centered, we've lost the sight of, but it's aimed at a collective journey. It's not just in isolation. And so while, yes, you have the athlete has to take ownership of their path and their direction, and they are empowered to speak up, they have responsibility. So does the coach, who's entrusted with leading the entire collective on that journey.
Thank you all for sharing with that. Doctors and others in the medical field pledge or do a pledge called the Hippocratic Oath, right? They take this oath of office. And one of the things that they talk about is, pledging to do no harm. Should coaches also pledge to do this, not only physically not to do harm, but mentally and emotionally not to do harm as well?
Yeah, I don't think coaches ever go into it with the intention to do harm, of course, but I think what's actually potentially more important is the education and preparation of the coaches, right? Like coaches are, I mean, in the end of the day, have a very similar level of connection and responsibility over the development of athletes as parents, as teachers, all of these people who go through full trainings, whether it's in university, educational training, or different things. So I think there's a lot of really interesting bills going in across different states that are looking to make sure that coaches are Title IX trained or trained on mental health strategies or just trained on managing a classroom or a group of young people. So I think just as much as the oath to do no harm, that there has to be something actually out there to make sure that they're equipped to not do harm.
Tara, let's pivot to you for a moment here. In your vast experience of playing soccer for so long, and I'm sure you dabbled in some other sports in your younger days, were you ever on teams or had coaches that believed in super long, exhaustive practices with a lot of verbal abuse? Did you ever encounter that, and how did that impact you as an athlete?
I gotta think back all those years back. Yes and no. I mean, I could give you an example of one time where I think I was maybe 15, maybe 14, 15, and we were playing in a game, and we were, like, long story short, we basically were just getting our butts handed to us. And the coach that I had at the time, quite aggressive, obviously was quite vocal and, very honest about how we were performing. And he made it very known that he was very upset with how we were performing. So to pretty much, kind of show how upset he was, he had us run during halftime. And it's funny because I didn't really think about that until I started kind of thinking about this panel, and sometimes you kind of put these memories in the back of your brain and don't think about it. But yeah, I I had moments, I had coaches that most definitely had their way of which they wanted us to train. They had their their own techniques and what they wanted to have us do. But um I can't really think of any coach that, deliberately wanted us to go out there and spend 2, 3 hours at a time, thinking that, the longer we were going to be out there, the better it was going to be for us. No, I think thankfully with the old school technique, I didn't really have coaches that had that sort of mind, like that mentality. But at least to say that I definitely did have coaches, whether that was throughout my youth career, even when I was at UNC playing under Anson Dorrance. I mean, it's always a bit of an obstacle playing in that program. But in terms of constantly going and going and going at us, I never really experienced that, which I'm thankful for, because I know there are players and athletes out there that do have coaches that are like that. They have that mentality, and they think the harder they push players and the more that they keep players going, that is gonna be beneficial. And it's not necessarily the case. And I think that's how people kind of think of the old school approach. So you have coaches that keep athletes out there for hours on end and, run them until run them into the ground. But thankfully I never experienced that. So, but like I said, I do know that there are definitely athletes out there that have, and they probably have stories on stories to tell about that.
Just to want to speak to something Sydney said, and Satara as well. When I was coaching college basketball in Calgary, Alberta, back in the 90s, I would have described I didn't know what I was doing, for starters. I was too young. Um, I wish I could go back in time. But the guy across town, I saw myself as a technical, tactical guy, like just, loved the technical, tactical side of the game. And the guy across town an old school coach, and he ran his players hard. But he did it with a very clear purpose to developing their character. He wasn't doing it punitively. And I think we've talked a couple times, just even in the first 20 minutes or so of our time together, about people misunderstanding why somebody else did something as a coach. So he was very strategic, is okay, Ron can do all the technical, tactical stuff he wants, but we're just going to be tougher in the moment. And his record against me was far superior. And so you could say his way won, but it was, I think, a big part of the bad version of old school coaching is when people are using things inappropriately. So there's a reason for, I had a coach. I mean, the best theory I've ever heard about how long should a basketball practice be? It should be as long as a game. Should be just under 2 hours, like, 90 minutes, 100 minutes around there, because that's how long a game is. Okay, well, that makes sense to me. So I think where it goes wrong is when people really don't understand the strategy if they're trying to copy somebody else. And we know there's a lot of copycatting going on in North American sport. There's tons. If Kyle is doing something with his pitching staff and it's working, I don't need to know the rationale. I'm just going to do it, because then I can always say, well, I did it because Kyle was doing it. He was in first place. I want to go back to Sydney's. Like, I wrote about 4 different notes here, around, the athletes wanting control, coaches trying to prove themselves to the athletes. If you asked me, if you had to nut it down to one thing you do in your practice, Ron, with the hundreds of coaches that I've worked with, I say it's help them identify who they are. Because I think the more we get grounded in who we are and what we're all about and what our personal coaching mission is, the less likely we go to the bad version of old school coaching. Because I thought, Sydney, I almost envision that as, athletes are wanting more control, and they should have more control. There's too much for the coach to do. We need the athletes to take on more leadership responsibilities, if nothing else, so the coach can do more technical, tactical coaching. Um, the but with that must come some better understanding of who I am, what I stand for, and how am I going to go about doing my job. And I think the reference to medical school, there's no doubt, as part of the Hippocratic Oath, Jeremy, is there's some time spent around who are you? What's your personality profile look like? And that's the most powerful thing I do in my practice, without question.
Yeah, just to jump on that, I think we a few guys I work with, we used to always talk about, whether it's the law field, the medical field, it's a practice. You're entering into a practice, this continued practice. How are we getting better? So we used to always joke around about, it's not about old school, new school. It's, are you in school? Are you continuing to get better and learn and grow? And I think to echo Ron's point of that, and that starts with knowing who I am, what's my identity, what's my job as a coach. It's to help each athlete realize that themselves and to form a collective one. Who are we as we go through this? So, I think when we've got clarity of that, then we can be very intentional with everything we do. There's a number of times I'll talk with a coach and we'll throw out some tactic, and I'm like, well, what's the intent behind it? It's not that the tactic's good or bad. It's what is your intent behind that. And so to say a long practice or running or raising your voice or whatever down the line are necessarily bad. It's what is the intent? What is that aimed at? And I think when those things are lined up and in sync with who I want to be and who I'm trying to create within my team, then more often than not, then we are going to execute well. Not to say we're going to be perfect. I think sometimes we expect perfection from our coaches and leaders in that. And then the very thing that we hate about old school coaches of developing a sense of fear in our athletes, we've created in our coaches as well. You can't do any of these things. But the more that I'm intentional, the more that I'm going to make the right decisions, as opposed to reacting out of a threat to my position, my control, my lack of security in who I am.
That's such a good point. Another thing I'm kind of hearing there too is coaches understanding themselves, but also understanding their team. Like you said, spending the time understanding what their team is. Because I do think even in programs, like it kind of oscillates. Like you have different changes. Like you're saying, sometimes you overcorrect and then you end up on the other side. And that happens with teams. And I think that's a part of the old school coaching thing too, that a coach has their way of doing things and they've been doing it for 20 years or however long, and it's never going to change. And there's levels where the athletes have to say, okay, I'm going to pick my battles. Is this specific thing coach wants something that, I really need to fight against, or maybe I can just get on the bus. But at the same time, there's some things that coaches are doing that are breaking down their team's ability to follow or to be successful or whatever, just because of the current makeup of the team. So making sure that coaches understand their athletes and what their team needs from year to year, or, part of the season to part of the season, is also super important.
Which I love, just to go one step further, Cindy, as you're talking about that. If I know who I am, then I know who's a good fit for what I'm trying to create, because not every athlete's going to click with every coach. Doesn't matter how great the coach is. And so I think sometimes, coming back to Ron gave the example of, so-and-so is doing this tactic, I'm going to do it. Well, he or she might have found more talented players or better fits for what he or she's doing, and has nothing to do with the tactic itself. But I know who I am. I know what I'm trying to create here, so I can then select accordingly, develop accordingly, then ultimately get everybody aligned around that to go get the most out of everybody.
I love that. I'm writing that down.
So we started talking about we and team and phrases like that. Have all of you found in your time as athletes, and some of you as coaches, found that old school coaches are less or more prone to have equal stakeholders on the team? Like, are athletes stakeholders, support staff stakeholders, or is it my team? Is it my way or the highway? What do you see out there in today's current landscape, and what are your feelings on it?
Jeremy, I'm just going to jump in real quick, and Satara, I'll be super fast here. I just want to double down before I make a comment about your question on something that Sydney and Kyle mentioned. In my 30 years of being around sport, old school coaching has gone bad where coaches were not performance managed. I think we're getting to a point where and I just mean normal performance management, like actually checking in on them and saying, okay, you plan to do this year or this quadrennial or whatever it would be, whether it's a high school coach, a clubs coach, Sheffield pro football coach, Syracuse, you name it. I think we had a stretch for about 20 or 30 years where there was just no performance management going on with coaches because coaches just were not interested. And so what I saw is where it really unraveled and really, really bad things happened, where I think it was a case of people not being given any feedback. So that's the comment, just going back one step. To your question is, one of the notes I made in prep for our time together, Jeremy, is there's a correlation between if you want to be really direct and coach your kids, your athletes, your people hard, you have to have a really strong relationship with them. And the harder you want to coach them, the better the relationship goes. So if you've got a great relationship with your staff and everybody, it's going to be hard to coach your athletes hard. In my opinion, it's going to maybe work for a couple of years, but something's going to go. But if I think, and I'm really interested to hear what Sydney and Satara have to say to this, is the stronger the trust between coach and athlete, I think the further you can go in terms of being super direct and coaching hard.
Ron, spot on. That's so spot on. And I was gonna say that I think that I'm seeing like a bit of a transition from, it is like coaches having it my way or the highway, and then it kind of transitioning into kind of developing a stronger, deeper relationship with players, kind of understanding who they are, as players, as humans. And like Ron said, I think that is one thing that I think has benefited me over the last 10 years, not even just the last 10 years as a professional, but the last 20 plus years being a soccer player. I find myself being at my best when I can trust my coach wholeheartedly, when I know that they actually kind of care about me, not just as a player, what can I do for them, but they care more about, Satara Murray, the person, the human. And that's one thing that I loved about, playing for UNC and playing at UNC and playing for Anson, because Anson, we had these core values. There were like 12 of them, and we had to each summer, like preseason, when each class had to memorize three, core values and then recite the quotes. And when we came into preseason, but I always wondered when I first came in as a freshman, I always wondered, like, what's the point of this? Didn't realize it until I left and I graduated, the importance of it. And Anson was just developing us as humans because he actually cared about us. He wanted us to go into this world and be better people. And so that's why I enjoyed my whole 4 years at UNC, because I love playing for Anson, because he trusted us, we trusted him. Now, throughout my career, my professional career, I've had, time, like quite a tumultuous time having really good coaches that were really good managers, like they were good people managers, but were they good coaches? No. And then vice versa. Um, and sometimes I think as coaches, you have to find a bit of a balance. Like you have to figure out how to get the best out of your players, but that comes with trust. It comes with development. It comes with allowing players to express themselves and be free. But it also comes with the other side of it, where you have to be a bit stern. You have to be a bit ruthless. You have to be a bit truthful with performance. And I feel like that transition is slowly happening, where you have old school coaching where it's my way or the highway, but now you're starting to see a little bit of a shift in coaches who are genuinely taking, making the effort to kind of get to know players, to build that trust, to allow players to understand, hey, this is a space where you can make mistakes. This is a space where you can express yourself. This is a place where you can be free. And I think that's how you can get the best out of your players. But then again, you do have those coaches that kind of are stuck in their ways, like Sydney said, they're stuck in their ways. They've been doing it for 20 plus years and they don't have any plans of changing it. But I am starting to see a bit of a transition, a bit of a shift, which is quite good to see.
I think just to jump in with two quick reflections, as Ron and Satara shared. One, something Ron said earlier about the specialists and how specialists have popped up. And I think to some extent, as head coaches, we've farmed out a lot of responsibility. Back in the day, again, you coached all of these things, and now we have a ton of specialists supporting the coach. Which is an awesome thing, because we've increased, the knowledge, increased the quality of instruction in those spaces. But again, those have to be aimed at a collective accountability. It can't be just empowerment with no accountability that comes with that, because ultimately, and ultimately the head coach is responsible for how all those pieces fit together. So I think, Jeremy, as you mentioned, the stakeholders, there's a lot more stakeholders than there ever have been before. We've empowered them. We have to make sure that they are all aligned at our common mission, and that's the coach's responsibility. I think the other part of it, as Cindy and Satara both have mentioned about the relationship piece. Ron talked about, the more the athlete knows you care, the harder you can coach them, the harder you can push them. I think, again, if we know ourselves and what does that look like, relationship, I think, no question, the care factor, 100% alignment, that's going to look different for different coaches and different athletes. And I think sometimes, again, coming back to a common theme throughout all this, if we're not defining what that really looks like, we can screw that concept up as well. And we swing the pendulum so far the other way now, where it's all about care, care, care with no challenge. And the reality is, as a coach, I'm navigating that challenge support tension. And I've got to understand myself and understand this athlete in terms of what does that athlete need to be able to execute it well.
I'll give a great example here. So just a couple of months ago, I did a series on my podcast where I interviewed just different stakeholders in college athletics around student athlete mental health. And I had a player and a coach both come on in different weeks and talk about their team and their experience. And one of the players told this story about his coach. It was Coach Ben Wilkins at Seton Hill basketball. It's a D2 program. And he says, they had a practice like on a Friday, and it was like one of the worst practices they ever had. No one was paying attention, balls were going everywhere. It was just not a great practice, to the point where coach kicked them out of practice and ended the practice early. Like, he's like, I've never seen coach that mad. And then that Sunday, there's like a whole group of guys on the team who are Steelers fans. And there's like a great drive or something. And randomly on a Sunday, coach texts the group chat of the Steelers and is just like, yeah, like, I can't believe that happened. So excited. And they come back on Monday and there's practice. Coach doesn't restate and apologize for yelling at them. I'm sorry I kicked you out of practice. He doesn't, kind of do this extra stuff, but he just shows the guys like, hey, I still care about you. We're still cool. There's no problem. And he's still able to be that tough coach, but no one's spending the whole weekend dreading going back on Monday. And I just thought, I always look back at that as like such a great example of how a coach can balance that relationship.
So something we were talking about a couple minutes ago, I heard, athletes, supporting athletes. I heard human. When we talk about old school coaches and supporting the athlete, supporting the human being, supporting the person that's the actual athlete, where do you think we are today when it comes to old school coaches, or as Kyle and Ron were saying, it's not necessarily old school or new school, it's more of, are they in school? I think that was what Kyle was saying, or maybe it was Ron, I can't remember. But when we're talking about athletes as human beings and focusing on the individual person and the team itself, as opposed to the focus being on the coach, what are we seeing today?
I think it's an awesome question. When I first started coaching, you could give an example of athletes were numbers. Hey, hey, 27, hey, 42, whatever else. And so there's been an evolution of that for sure, as we've talked about relationship based and caring about your athlete and everything else. Interesting, as I've looked at the highest level of sport, professional and college to some extent, I think a lot of places athletes are still numbers. It's not your uniform number, it's your performance numbers. It's the statistical line, it's whatever else. So I think the best coaches have always seen more than a number. They've seen that person, they've seen who they are, they've seen more than a skill set, more than a tool set. I've got a buddy of mine who used to always say that the first time he experienced a coach or a mentor or somebody in his life that saw him as more than a tool set, a skill set, it shocked him to actually care who this person is. So I think we've made strides. I think we're going to continue to make strides. I think part of it's just the simplicity of we're in a space where results do matter, and it's easy to get pulled to that. A number of people on the panel have made comments about caring about the longer term more than just this season or this game. But I think that's the challenge for us, is to see the person. We're people before we are performers, and to make sure we're starting there as we coach and lead people.
Now, or something that we're seeing with coaches
Jeremy,
these days. Oh, go ahead. Go
yeah,
ahead,
I'm
please.
sorry. I'm not, my fingers are slower than they used to be. First of all, this is going to be an amazing session because the Pittsburgh Steelers were mentioned. And I just want to say that, Jeremy, this might be your most subscribed webinar ever when people pick that up. Secondly, to this idea of like, I think I hear when you ask that question, Jeremy, like holistic coaching, coaching the whole person. Um, you know, we heard it from both of our athletes, Sydney and Satara, around like development. Satara again said that early, right? The development. But I'm going to go back to coaching purpose and understanding, and we use the words definitions a lot, is I think we give the coaches the keys to a role at a club, at a college team, a pro team. And I really don't, I think they both the athletic director or the director and the coach pretty much know what they're supposed to do, but I really don't think they know exactly what they're supposed to do. So I'm going to just read something for you. I'm going to read an example of a purpose statement that I think answers your question, Jeremy, ultimately. There's a coach in Australia that I work with. Her name is Stacia, and she would be perfectly all right with me sharing this with everyone. And part of the reason we came together to do some work was around, I want to kind of reestablish my baseline, my purpose. And this is her purpose: the creation of confident, balanced, independent, and resilient women who lead and empower those around them to do and be the same. That's all she needs. Because when the world gets turbulent and you're not really sure, because your stakeholders are making your world crazy, and you've got three more things that you have to learn, as Kyle keeps talking about, like we're in a learning process, you go back to that. And you when the turbulence that's what I instill in my clients is go back, and your answer is in your purpose. So it sounds simplistic, but it is without the definitions and the clarity, Jeremy, you can't actually attend to mental health and holistic coaching properly.
No, thank you for interrupting there, Ron, and sharing that. That was that was incredible, and we appreciate it. Let's talk about accountability for a second. Looking back at time in my own experiences as a coach or an athlete, whether it was in the U.S. or internationally, I found that there was really no correlation on old school coaches and either accepting accountability for everything that the team did or passing that accountability on, normally in a negative sense, to an athlete, or if the entire team performed poorly. What are you seeing today when it comes to coaches in general, not even old school coaches? Where does accountability lie? Do you think that coaches today, who might be old school, we'll just ask this question, coaches today that still might be old school, are they retaining the accountability of good and poor performance, or are they passing it on to the players on the teams?
I've had a mix of both. I've had coaches that have easily, if we go out there and we don't have the greatest performance, will, happily hold their hand up high and say, listen, that's on me. Now we got to go back to the drawing board and make sure things are right for the next game. And then I've had like the opposite, where a coach will happily just spread that, that responsibility onto us as a team and not hold themselves accountable, in any regards. But I think it just depends on who you're dealing with. And, on the topic of accountability, not just from a coaching standpoint, but from a coaching standpoint, but how in which coaches hold players accountable in general. That's something that I'm struggling with dealing with right now in the situation that I'm in terms of I'm the average age on my team at Sheffield is like 12. I'm the oldest, and it's a relatively young team, and it's a team full of girls that are very inexperienced, and it's a team full of girls that have kind of come through the system that probably not really held accountable for anything, kind of probably been told they've been good their whole lives, whatever. And now they're in first team football, they're in professional football, and it's, now things get a little bit harder, a little bit difficult. And I think the one thing that we're lacking is accountability, but that comes from the higher ups, that comes from my coach, that comes from my assistant coaches, the technical staff, to be able to pull girls on their mess and say, listen, you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right. But I think my manager wants myself as a captain and our leadership group to kind of be the ones to hold each other accountable, when I think sometimes it really is important for, my manager and for, just people in the higher ups to be able to hold us accountable as a team collectively. But to answer your original question, yeah, I think I've had a mix of both, coaches that will happily say, yeah, you know what, that's on me. And then ones that won't take any accountability at all for anything and kind of shove that responsibility onto us as a team.
I
So Tara,
certainly,
I'm just real
oh,
quickly, Tara, sorry, Sydney. In that leadership group,
Mhm.
is your remit really clear? Like, is it really clear how you're supposed to work together, what you're responsible for? How would you describe that?
That is a loaded question, because I've been a part of the leadership group now for what, it's Feb, almost March, for the last 6, 7 months. And to answer your question, yes and no. I know that sounds really confusing. Um, Obviously, walking into my leadership group, I did kind of have a plan in action to see how I kind of wanted to approach the situation. And now with being the captain, I felt like there's a different level of responsibility that I should take on, but it hasn't really been passed on to me to take on that responsibility, if that makes sense. So, when I initially got asked to be a part of this leadership group and to become the captain, yes, I did think that there was a clear-cut understanding of what our roles and responsibility was to be that group. And I just feel as though we haven't really been put in a place to be able to carry out that responsibility. And so it just makes it a bit frustrating, because I think if I had more say, got a chance to kind of, lead in the way that I want to, things could potentially be different, but I just haven't really been given that space to be able to do that.
that honestly leads into exactly what I was going to say. It's like we're kind of starting this conversation about additional leadership or leadership groups or different captains. And I'll say yes, that managing that accountability or managing the relationship as a leader on the team between coaches and players, but then how the players see the coach is also can be very difficult. And in the end, I do think it is the coach's responsibility in a lot of ways to manage that relationship, because I have been on teams where things happen and we're asking, you eventually go up to the coach for help and they're like, that's what you were supposed to do. That's kind of your job, or different things. And it can be very hard to manage both, because you are a player in the end and you don't know exactly how much leadership or authority that you have. So you don't want to overstep, because that can also, for you, affect your own ability to play or how you're perceived or how you're able to move in the team dynamic.
One of one of our audience sent me a message, Donald. I saw what you said, and I was actually going to ask this anyways, just in a different light. He just wrote 2 words: Bobby Knight. For those in the audience, Bobby Knight was a extraordinarily successful coach in collegiate basketball. But a lot of people over time have reflected back and maybe agreed that his ways weren't necessarily the best ways, or that he even a lot of people believe that he held a extremely toxic culture in his organization. Old school coaches, a lot of times, are perceived as toxic coaches, and that isn't necessarily the case, and that's not what we're trying to say today. But in this case of the Bobby Knights of the world, or extremely toxic coaches in general, but who are extremely successful, what do you as coaches and supporters of coaches and you as athletes think about situations like that, coaches like Bobby Knight, who are extremely old school?
Um, I wrote something like this in my notes. I'm not familiar directly with Bobby Knight, but I was thinking of myself like, oh, like looking back at the coaches that I've had that you might now deem as toxic, would I change that experience? And I kind of look back and I say no. And the reason for it is some of like the mental things whenever I've been able to grow as a person. But when I actually am just like directly honest, it's because of the performance and the opportunities that I was able to have. So I think one of the biggest things for athletes is recognizing like, hey, if you want to play for this top program or if you want these experiences, sometimes there might be some negative aspects to the coaches or to the program, and you have to figure out what those are and figure out how to deal with it, or if you want to deal with it.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback off of Sydney and say the same exact thing. As looking back on how I've been coached, old school coaching, I wouldn't change it for the world because I think it ultimately allowed me to develop and become who I am today. So I think some things back then wouldn't really pass today, but yeah, like Sydney said, I think if you know kind of early on what you're kind of stepping into before you go, and if it's something that you know that you're willing to kind of take on, and knowing that there's going to be a little bit of negativity, you might get a little bit of a mental breakdown at some point, but it's worth it at the end, then yeah, but yeah, I think I looking back, it's not something I would change at all. I think it was exactly how it was supposed to be. Yeah, and I enjoyed it.
I think it's fascinating to me because I'll a lot of times I'll be with coaches, leaders, and Bobby gets brought up, and there's a number of people who would swear not just as an athlete, but who they are as a man today is attributed to Coach Knight. And so I think just as I listened to Sydney and Satara both share that, again, this is why you come back to it's easy for us to say good, bad. There's positives, there's negatives. There's things I know. I went to undergrad in Indiana. There's a lot of basketball coaches who tried to be Bobby Knight. They weren't, coming back to Ron's point, their own identity, their own skill set, their own strengths, whatever else, different type of coach. And so we're trying to copy somebody that we don't fully understand or we are wired differently. But I think it's easy for us to also to criticize different eras when the society and everything else is different, and how we navigate some of those things. So yeah, I think the easy thing to say good, bad versus no, there's some good, there's some bad. There's probably some things we could probably do a little bit better. I know in the 20 plus years of coaching and leading I've done, there's things I look back on and go, I probably could have done that a little bit differently, a little bit better.
I listed off the three different categories, like the two different categories, so the good and the bad. And I listed three things off for both. Knight covers all of it: command and control, one-way, harsh, mission-focused, environment of accountability, and development centered. So he did all of it. This isn't a setup either. Season on the brink. I read this before every season I coached at Mount Royal College in Calgary. He was my hero growing up, but I would not wish Bobby Knight on Sydney or Satara ever, based on what I know now. So complex, and I love Kyle's comment about the eras. We have to pay attention to that things were different, but he definitely covered it all.
Coming close to the end of our time here today. Thank you. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. But before we go, something I like to do is kind of ask for last thoughts, parting thoughts. So let's start with you, Satara. If there's one thing that you could share with the audience, whether they're joining us today or for a replay, what would you like to share with them about your thoughts about old school coaching, whether it's positive or negative?
Yeah, I don't think old school coaching should be viewed as negative. Like Hal said, there's no good, there's no bad. It's just, everything in between. I think growing up and being a part of that era where, coaching was a certain way. Obviously it's changed, it's different now. You have kind of a new approach to coaching, a new style and way coaches kind of approach their athletes. But yeah, I would just say there's nothing negative about it. Everybody has their approach to coaching, whether people agree with it or not. Everybody kind of has their own way and how they approach sports, their athletes, their vision, and how they want to execute it. And so, yeah, I enjoyed being a part of a generation where, people probably thought the coaches were insane, but sometimes it works for people, sometimes it doesn't. But for me, it did. And I'm thankful for it because, it allowed me to have a long, professional career. And I wouldn't change it for the world. So, yeah.
Ron, what are your parting thoughts here today?
That's a hard task you've given us here. There's a lot that's changed in sport in the last 15 or 20 years. One thing hasn't, and that the coach remains the accountable officer for a team. It's different. They need to be more collaborative. They need to do it differently. But so the two thoughts I have are, let's recognize that they are the accountable officer, wins and losses, player development, you name it. And we need to support our coaches. They push away and say, I don't need support. They need it. We need to performance manage them. We need to get them to be more holistic in their perspective, and that's what's going to make sport better for young people.
Kyle, what are your parting thoughts here today?
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I think probably two quick thoughts that I'll leave with is one, we have to recognize again the recipe for what great coaching, the principles that are in place, what we need to ultimately get done with our athletes and teams, that has not changed. I think the methods we have to continue evolving and get better at. But I think we have to recognize we're getting our athletes in a different spot based on how society's preparing them. And so I do have to be aware of some of those things and adjust some approaches. The second thing, and I'll tie back to a comment that a few different of the panelists have said, a lot of times we ask ourselves, okay, why do I coach? My purpose. I think the potentially the more important question is, why do I coach the way I do? If I've made sense of why I coach the way I do, if I have a chance to be more intentional and be more intentional with how I execute different things with my athletes and with my teams. So again, awareness of what society is doing to prepare our athletes when we get them. And then the second part of it is to be really intentional and make sense of, why do I coach the way I do? Am I just doing how I was coached, or swinging the pendulum the other way? Or have I decided that this is who I am and this is the best way for me to go be successful?
And Sydney, please share your parting thoughts.
Oh, there's so pressure being the last one. I think just wrapping up this whole conversation is realizing that things are constantly changing and we're constantly learning, right? Like new books, new techniques, new athletes, like things are constantly coming into coaches' lives, into athletes' lives. So going back to what Kyle said, it's not old school or new school, it's in school, and just making sure you're committed to learning in that process.
I'd like to thank each of you so much today for being on this panel today. Your not only your expertise, but sharing your experiences and your thoughts on this topic was extremely incredible. So I thank each and every one of you. I'd also like to thank all of the audience who has taken their time to join us today. It's a testament to you wanting to be better coaches, better support staff, better leaders within sports. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining the Culture Roundtable. If you'd like to learn more about culture and sports or our programs, please visit cultureandsports.com. Have a great day.